Hello, everybody. My name is Matt Calkins. I am a family medicine physician. Thank you for joining us for our nutrition curriculum. This is the introduction to Module 1 and a lecture on the history of nutrition. Let's get started. First, my disclosure. I am an investigator in a study that utilizes continuous glucose monitors that are provided by Abbott. So the overarching goal of this nutrition curriculum is to give you the knowledge necessary to counsel your patients. To do this, we'll discuss in depth the key 6 points below. This is a roadmap of the entire nutrition curriculum. We will start from the ground up, with each module building and reinforcing information from the prior modules. First, it is worthwhile to have a discussion of the history of nutrition in order to understand how the current guidelines were developed. To piggyback off that, you must understand the statistical methods used in nutrition research, which are used for the guidelines. Next, we'll dive into the science of nutrition itself with nutritional biochemistry and metabolism, where we introduce macronutrients, micronutrients, and hunger and satiety mechanisms. From there, we can apply that knowledge to diseases with metabolic pathophysiology. We finally discuss different dietary patterns, including the 3 ways we can restrict food intake: time, amount, or macronutrients. We will investigate each of these in further detail in that lecture. Finally, we investigate emerging research on neurological control over food intake, including the introduction of food addiction. Module 1 specifically will cover the history of nutrition and nutrition research. The overall goal of the next few lectures in Module 1 is to appreciate the history of nutrition and obtain an understanding of nutrition research. You will complete a food frequency questionnaire and critically appraise the data that provides for nutritional epidemiology. You will then watch a few lectures that will help you recognize the limitations of nutritional epidemiology. Finally, putting it all together, the above information, you can better understand why we do not have a consensus in nutrition. The majority of this introduction will be spent on the history of nutrition, then a slide with the current scope of metabolic disease in the United States, and finally a discussion on the current guidelines by major societies regarding nutrition.
Nutrition has been paramount to survival through every era of human history. The most common profound aspect of nutrition, or lack thereof, on humans has been the deficiencies, including the vitamin deficiencies of beriberi, pellagra, scurvy, and rickets, which we have known their clinical syndromes for centuries, even if we did not know their underlying etiologies. Therefore, it was difficult to say exactly where our discussion of nutrition research should start. Additionally, you could easily get a PhD in nutrition history, even for each of the decades that we'll discuss on the next few slides. So therefore, this review was condensed to get you, the clinician, the information needed to hopefully make sense of the current landscape of nutrition. And so I decided to start our discussion with one of the more famous first publications of a low carbohydrate diet. Brillat Savarin was a French lawyer, politician, and writer, and noticed anecdotally that animals and men who ate starches grew fat. Motivated by this observation, he published The Physiology of Taste in 1825, which is one of the first low-carbohydrate dieting manuscripts ever published. He became to be known as the father of low carb. However, I would say nutrition research began really in earnest in 1854 with, surprisingly, an infectious disease outbreak. In this year, there was a cholera outbreak in London. John Snow, a prominent English physician and a leader in hygiene theory, connected the exposure of certain wells in London with the incidence of cholera. He was able to pinpoint that most cases of the cholera had exposures to a Broad Street well, or a well on Broad Street in London. Officials were so convinced that they removed the handle to the well, thus ending the epidemic. This was the first ever epidemiological study, which is a study that only observes exposures and correlates those with outcomes of population. There's no intervention group like in a randomized controlled trial. This is the type of study that the vast majority of nutritional science is based upon today. And because of that fact, I wanted to take a moment just to discuss the 3 main types of epidemiological studies. The main one that you may be familiar with and we'll talk about later, such like the Framingham study, is a prospective study where you measure exposures at the start of the study, and you can continue to measure exposures if you want throughout time, where this arrow represents time. And then at some point in the study, you collect your outcomes and you work back to see which exposures are correlated with that outcome. Additionally, you could do a retrospective study, so you can go backwards in time. You start with the outcomes and you look for exposures. This is most common with diseases that are extremely rare. And finally, John Snow most likely did a cross-sectional study where at a single point in time, you look at both the exposures and you measure the observation, connecting the Broad Street well with cholera. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln gave the USDA authority for nutrition education and information. The USDA's current contribution to public health include their food pyramid and MyPlate. 1963, William Banting, a prominent overweight funeral director in London, wrote the Letter on Corpulence addressed to the public, which became an even more famous manuscript on low-carb dieting. William Banting himself learned of carbohydrate restriction from Dr. William Harvey, who learned from Claude Bernard, a French physiologist who famously discovered that the liver synthesized and releases glucose. Based on this mechanistic data, Claude Bernard would go on to recommend low-carb dieting, and that's where Banting got his idea from. This is the first mechanistic data to recommend one diet over the other. However, really evidence-based medicine, as we think about it today, would not recommend one or the other at that time. There was really no other data to recommend either a low-carb or low-fat diet besides anecdotal data. In 1885, Dr. Kellogg filed the first patent for flaked cereals, which we will discuss more in the early 20th century. And also in 1895, the USDA, led by Dr. Atwater, who was described as the father of nutrition research and metabolism, published research findings for the famous 4 kilocalorie per gram of carbohydrates and protein and 9 kilocalorie per gram for fat, respectively, which laid the foundation to accurately count nutrient intake for future epidemiological studies. To discuss the history of nutrition in the 20th century, we will divide our timeline into 20-year increments, starting with 1900 through 1920. While Savarin and Banting published the first manuscripts on carbohydrate restriction in the 19th century, Ellen G. White was one of the first leading proponents of vegetarianism. Ellen White, one of the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, published one of her more famous books in 1905 titled The Ministry of Healing. There's an excellent review article in the peer-reviewed journal Religions, which was published in 2018. This article was written by researchers from Loma Linda University in California, which is a Seventh-day Adventist Church-based university. This article reviews the major and lasting impact that the Seventh-day Adventist Church has had on dietary guidelines in the United States. The initial endorsement of vegetarianism in the early 20th century was based largely on religious and moral grounds. Ellen G. White was quoted as saying that grains, fruits, nuts, and vegetables constitute the diet chosen for us by our Creator. Additionally, the research article goes on to say that Ellen White had originally supported lifestyle reform on moral grounds, such as to control sexual appetite and avoid sin. There's an excellent write-up in this article as well regarding the Battle Creek Sanitarium, a hospital run by the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Michigan, which practiced vegetarianism for its patients. And from this hospital, Dr. Harvey Kellogg patented his first flaked cereals that we discussed in 1895. Overall, Seventh-day Adventists have developed 80 grain and nut-based products and 100 cereal-based companies. Today, Seventh-day Adventists remain active in research into exploring the health benefits of vegetarianism, with 3 prospective cohort studies that have been conducted over the past 50 years. This would all become the beginning of the low-fat, whole-food, plant-based diet that would stand in opposition to the low-carbohydrate diet. Some important primary research and journal articles round out the 1910s. In 1912, Casimir Funk, a Polish biochemist, isolated B3 from rice husks for the first time. The motivation for this discovery came from the fact that when people began eating fully milled, dehusked rice, they developed beriberi. Casimir Funk took these rice husks and isolated a substance he went on to call a vital amine, which became vitamins. He would go on to discover and isolate B1, which is the actual cause of beriberi. This was monumental in nutrition research as we finally found the underlying molecules that caused nutritional deficiencies that have plagued humans forever. We would go on to fortify our foods with these vital amines, which made these nutritional deficiencies nearly a thing of the past in developed countries and one of the greatest public health accomplishments of all time. Also in 1912, a paper titled Clinical Features of Sudden Obstruction of the Coronary Arteries was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. This was a landmark publication because the clinical syndrome that we now know as acute coronary syndrome was first described in this article, and it linked that syndrome with the histopathological plaques that are found in coronary arteries. 1 year later from that, a paper was published which fed cholesterol to rabbits to correlate cholesterol intake with plaques. Essentially, this study force-fed egg yolks to rabbits, and then upon dissection, it was noted that there was a significant burden of atherosclerotic plaque in the aorta. The conclusion was that dietary cholesterol from egg yolks was causative of these plaques. Finally, in 1916, the USDA published their first food guide, which was largely based on what the average healthy, non-nutritionally deficient American ate. At this point, the needed amount of micronutrients for humans was not yet established. Moving on to 1920 through 1940. This time period set the stage for the recommended daily allowances that would soon be created with the advent of World War II. The USDA published the macronutrient and micronutrient composition of many different foods, which could then be used to give the recommendations for the minimum intake of whole foods. The 1900s through 1940s could be described as a period of undernutrition with the tools to finally fight the diseases of nutritional deficiencies. Heart disease began to become more noticed clinically with the first publication of what would go on to become acute coronary syndrome in 1912. And finally, the USDA put in amazing work to lay the foundation of nutrition research. In 1941, the Recommended Daily Allowances, or RDA, was published from the National Nutrition Conference for Defense. It was no coincidence that this coincided with the start of World War II and was based upon the excellent work of the USDA over the past decade, as we discussed earlier. These RDAs were created from the concern that Americans' food supply may be stretched thin either by rationing or outright invasion, and the government needed to know what is the minimum amount of nutrition a human could subsist upon yet still perform their patriotic duty. Many Americans heard of cardiovascular disease for the first time when FDR unfortunately suffered a fatal hemorrhagic stroke in 1945. A few years later, President Harry Truman created the National School Lunch Program Initiative in 1946, which is one of the first federal programs to identify the importance of nutrition in kids. Partly because of the FDR stroke, the Framingham study was initiated in 1948 in Framingham, Massachusetts, one of the most famous prospective cohort studies, which is also known as an observational epidemiological studies of all time. Researchers were hoping to find key markers and risk factors, which are also known as exposures, for the main outcome of cardiovascular disease. And if FDR's fatal hemorrhagic stroke in 45 put cardiovascular disease in the minds of the American people, then President Eisenhower's myocardial infarction in 1952 brought it straight to the forefront. This is a major factor in the increase in research into cardiovascular disease. And a few short years later, the diet wars continued with the publication of Diet and Coronary Thrombosis by John Yudkin in 1957, in which he didn't really advocate for a single macronutrient as causative of coronary heart disease, but he was leaning more towards sugar at this time. 1 year later, the famous epidemiological 7-country study was published by Ansel Keys. Ansel Keys correlated the exposure of saturated fat intake with the outcomes of LDL and coronary heart disease. Keys was unrelenting and not a big fan of Yudkin. Keys said of Yudkin that, quote, "It is clear that you have no theoretical basis or experimental evidence to support his claim for major influence of dietary sucrose in the etiology of coronary heart disease." The research that started in 1940 began to pay off in the 60s and 70s. Saturated fat was targeted as the underlying etiology of cardiovascular disease when the American Heart Association made its first recommendation to decrease saturated fat in the diet in 1961. 1966, 68, and 72 saw the publication of 3 major landmark cluster randomized or randomized controlled trials. The 2 more famous of these are known as the LA Veterans Association study and the Finnish Mental Hospital study. Essentially, researchers took the wards of 2 mental hospitals or the LA Veterans Association and divided subjects into 2 groups: normal American diet, high in saturated fat, or a low saturated fat diet. To accomplish this, they replaced common food items that were high in saturated fat with poly and monounsaturated fat. For example, they took butter and replaced it with margarine in the low saturated fat group. They measured LDL plus causes of death. Although there was no difference between the primary endpoint of all-cause mortality in any of the 3 studies, secondary composite endpoints for numerous cardiovascular outcomes were significant, bolstering the link between saturated fat, LDL, and heart disease. John Yudkin appeared on the scene again in 1972 with a book for laypeople titled Pure, White, and Deadly, where he laid out his theory that sucrose intake was the main driver of cardiovascular disease. The federal government only partly agreed, and in 1977, the U.S. Senate Committee released the Dietary Goals for the U.S., which endorsed a low-fat, low-cholesterol diet with a reduction in sugar intake by about 40%. The USDA released their own recommendations 3 years later in 1980 and recommended avoiding both fat and avoid too much sugar. Through the 1940s to the 1980s, the fortification of foods in the early 20th century gave way to an overabundance of highly palatable, high carbohydrate, high fat foods, which stoked the fire of metabolic disease. The war of saturated fat versus sugar as the primary underlying etiology of cardiovascular disease continued to rage. However, more and more guidelines seemed to place the blame on saturated fat. In 1984, we see the famous Time magazine cover regarding the bad news of cholesterol. This cover was created due to the Lipid Research Clinic's coronary primary prevention trial. This trial, which consisted of 3,800 men with primary hypercholesterolemia, had an intervention group of cholestyramine, which is a bile acid sequestrant, and diet, and a control group of diet alone with placebo. They followed up for 7.4 years, and the difference in LDL between the groups was 12.6% decrease with that intervention of cholestyramine. And looking at the outcomes down here, the primary endpoint of coronary heart disease death and non-fatal MI was 24% less in the cholestyramine group. The 7-year incidence of the primary endpoint was 7% in the cholestyramine group versus 8.6% in the placebo group, for an absolute risk reduction of 1.6%. There was no difference in all-cause mortality. In 1988, the Surgeon General weighed in with his report on nutrition and health, in which he endorsed a low-saturated fat diet. This was monumental, as the last prior Surgeon General report was in 1964 on the dangers of smoking. In 1992, the USDA adopted the famous food pyramid, which had a base of 6 to 11 servings of bread, cereal, rice, and pasta. In 1998, the American Dietetic Association endorsed vegetarianism. which had 5 of 9 voting members as Seventh-day Adventist Church, according to the religions article we discussed earlier. Finally, in 2000, NHANES, which is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, released their data for the first time. This data is collected by interviews, physical examinations, lab tests, and food frequency questionnaires. It was first conducted in 1971, became annual in 1999, and was first published in 2000-2001. This data demonstrated that Americans were indeed decreasing their fat intake as a percentage of calories by about 4%. And finally, we have the 2000s through 2020. In 2007, clinicaltrials.gov required registration of all randomized controlled trials. Although it existed before this was when it became mandatory after being expanded in 2007. Currently, up through today, nutritional, epidemiological, or observational studies are not required, unfortunately, to be registered. In 2009, Dr. Robert Lustig, who you'll watch a lecture of later, published a video titled Sugar, the Bitter Truth, which reinvigorated interest as the primary driver of metabolic disease. Interestingly, he made this video independent of the information provided by John Yudkin, although he would later learn of Yudkin and agree with him. In 2011, the USDA moved away from the food pyramid to MyPlate. In 2012, Pure, White, and Deadly was republished, partly based on the good response to Dr. Lustig's video in 2009. In 2013, we have one of the first large randomized controlled trials using dietary intervention to change the risk of heart disease. Unfortunately, Predimed was retracted and then republished due to concerns of improper randomization. The conclusion of this article is that the Mediterranean diet improves the risk of cardiovascular disease. However, it has never really fully overcome the fact that it was retracted. Also, in 2013, the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association released their 2013 guidelines, which removed their prior recommendation of less than 300 milligrams per day of dietary cholesterol intake. As more studies were published which called into question the role of dietary cholesterol in cardiovascular disease, this was the first guideline which stated there was now insufficient evidence to continue to recommend any limit on dietary cholesterol intake. Finally, in 2018, Diet Fits was published in JAMA, which was another large dietary randomized controlled trial which demonstrated no difference between the low-fat or low-carb arm for weight loss. However, there were methodological issues for both arms of the study. To sum up the 20th into the 21st century, we identified and treated nutritional deficiencies via fortification. We then developed hyperpalatable foods which fueled our metabolic epidemic. The debate regarding saturated fat for sugar as the primary etiology of cardiovascular disease and metabolic disease at large continues to rage. And finally, we are in the midst of a massive pandemic of metabolic disease currently. Warren Buffett summed up the current strain of these diseases on the American healthcare system and well-being of Americans in general by saying that the U.S. healthcare system is the tapeworm of the American economy. Moving on to 2021. The current scope of metabolic diseases in this country is pretty bad. 1 in 5 deaths globally is linked to poor diets. The metabolic diseases listed here comprise 75% of the global healthcare costs, and a little less than 32% of adults have obesity as of 2019, and only 12% of adults in America have 0 of 5 criteria for metabolic syndrome. From Dr. Mozaffarian's lecture, which you'll watch in a little bit, cardiovascular disease costs us $300 billion a year, with $190 billion of that being direct costs and $120 being lost productivity. You can compare this to the CDC budget of $5 billion. All obesity-related conditions cost us approximately $1.42 trillion a year. Switching gears to looking at guidelines, this is a figure from the USDA Dietary Guidelines for Americans in the 2020 through 2025 cycle. It shows that approximately three-fifths of Americans are adhering to the DGA guidelines. And as a reminder, the 1980 Dietary Guidelines for Americans are shown on the left, and the current guidelines are shown on the right. There has been a movement away from serving sizes, and it is becoming more food-based recommendations. There is a continuing recommendation for grains, at least half of which are whole grains. Additionally, there is still a recommendation of less than 10% of calories as saturated fat, and less than 10% of calories should be coming from added sugars. The American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association guideline on the primary prevention of cardiovascular disease, which is essentially every American that does not have a history of a heart attack or risk factors great enough to make them secondary prevention, recommends that a healthy lifestyle throughout life and a diet that emphasizes whole grains, lean vegetable or animal protein, minimization of red meat and processed red meats, and minimization of refined carbohydrates. This change from macronutrient recommendations to more food recommendations can be underlined in a study that was published 1 year after those guidelines in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. This was a state-of-the-art review where they discussed saturated fat, and specifically certain foods that are high in saturated fat, such as whole fat dairy, unprocessed meat, and dark chocolate, which have a complex matrix of micronutrients, and they are not associated with the increased risk of cardiovascular disease. They go on to say the totality of available evidence does not support further limiting the intake of such foods, even though they are high in saturated fat. And finally, the most recent American Diabetes Association Standards of Medical Care and Diabetes for 2021 endorses that reducing overall carbohydrate intake for individuals with diabetes demonstrates the most evidence for improving glycemia. One last thought I'd like to leave you before you start Module 1 is a quote from Dr. David Katz, who was being interviewed on a podcast that discussed the importance of nutrition with regards to public health. And I think it accurately describes my thought on using nutrition as clinicians. He said, quote, "Imagine if engineers build suspension bridges but did not address their weight-bearing capacity. That would be a professional deficiency, and it would be an ethical lapse." His analogy was to physicians. Imagine if physicians treated patients' high blood pressures or dyslipidemia or glucose intolerance, but did not address their nutritional status. That would be professional deficiency, and it would be an ethical lapse. Finally, here's a list of your to-do items for the module. You will complete a food frequency questionnaire, which is how nutrition researchers collect the exposure to foods, macronutrients, and micronutrients when are then correlated to disease outcomes, much like Dr. John Snow linked exposure to the Broad Street well with the outcome of obtaining cholera. Pay special attention to Dr. Ioannidis' lecture, The Role of Bias for Nutrition Research. His lecture is so critical to the understanding of nutrition that I created a lecture based off of one of his slides titled Typical Recipe of Nutrition Research. Enjoy the module.